In the spring of 1879, in the river country below the Bitterroot Range in western Montana Territory, a woman of 28 years stood at the edge of a swollen creek and counted out $11 into the open palm of a man who could not stop laughing at her. The mill behind him was a ruin. The flood of the previous October had torn through the valley and left the gristmill of the dead town of Hare's Crossing, half buried in gravel and silt, its wheels snapped from its shaft, its lower story choked with river mud to the height of a tall man's chest. The man taking her money was the county clerk, and he was selling the wreck because no one had paid the back taxes on it in 3 years, and no one ever would. He told her she had bought herself a grave with a roof. She folded the receipt and said nothing. What he did not know, what no one in that valley knew, was that the woman, counting out her last dollars, had been taught to read stone the way other people read a printed page, and that the gristmill of Hare's Crossing held inside its drowned foundation a chamber that had been sealed for 19 years, and that what waited in that chamber would settle a debt the whole county had agreed to forget. Her name was Cora Finch, and she had arrived in the valley with a wagon, a gray mule named Pell, and a wooden box of mason's tools that had belonged to a man who was now 3 months in his grave. She did not look like someone who could lift the things she meant to lift. She was slight, and her hands, though hard, were not large. The men who gathered at the clerk's office to watch the sale had measured her with their eyes and found her wanting, and they had said so to one another in the easy, unhurried way of men who believe they are right. A mill takes a strong back and a strong purse. One of them said she had neither. She heard it. She did not answer it. She had learned long ago that the answer to that kind of talk was not made of words. I will tell you now that she opened the chamber alone, and that what she found there did not make her rich, and that the men who laughed did not stay laughing. Yet the opening took her the better part of a season, and the finding took longer than that, and to understand why a flood-wrecked mill was worth $11 and a summer of a woman's life, you have to understand the man who taught her and the work he left in her hands. His name had been Amos Reed, and he had been a stonemason in the Pennsylvania hills before the war and a builder of mill dams and foundations after it. And he had found Cora as a girl of 9, orphaned and half feral in a flooded coal town, sorting through the wreck of her family's house for anything that could be sold. He had not adopted her in any way the law would recognize. He had simply put a chisel in her hand and told her that a stone has a grain the same as wood, that every block of it remembers the bed it was cut from, and that a person who learns to listen to that grain can split a ton of granite along a line no thicker than a hair. For 19 years she had worked at his side, in mill towns and railroad cuts and the foundations of banks that would later refuse her a loan, and she had become better at the work than he was, though neither of them ever said so. He died in the winter of that year of a cough that would not leave his chest, and at the end he told her one thing about the valley below the Bitterroot, and that one thing was the reason she came. He told her he had built a mill there once in 1860 for a man named Josiah Vane, and that he had built into its foundation a chamber that no flood would ever reach, a dry stone vault below the waterline, sealed with a mason's lock of his own devising. He told her that Vane had paid him to build it, and then had not paid him at all, and that there was more wrong in that valley than an unpaid wage, and that if she ever found herself near Hare's Crossing, she should look at the mill with the eyes he had given her. Then he closed his own eyes and did not open them again. She buried him, sold what could be sold, and pointed the mule west. The valley, when she reached it, was greener and lonelier than she had expected. Hare's Crossing had been a town of perhaps 200 souls before the flood, a single street of frame buildings serving the farms that grew wheat and barley on the river bottom, and the mill had been its heart, the place where every harvest was ground and weighed and paid for. Now the street was empty. The flood had taken the lower half of the town, and the people had taken themselves elsewhere, to the new rail town of Coulter, 8 miles south, and what remained was a scatter of roofless houses, and the great dark hulk of the mill, standing in its bed of gravel, like the carcass of some enormous animal that had crawled up out of the water to die. She camped the first night on the high ground above the mill and studied it in the last of the light. It was a tall building of mortared fieldstone for its first story and squared timber above, and the flood had done to it what floods do, had shouldered against its upstream wall and packed it to the window sills with silt and stranded a whole uprooted cottonwood across its roof. The wheel lay in the creek below, a wreck of rotted paddles and a bent iron shaft. To any eye but hers, it was finished. To her eye, it was a question, because the lower courses of that upstream wall, the ones the flood had scoured clean of their facing, had been laid by a hand she knew as well as her own, and the pattern of their laying told her that Amos had been telling the truth. The next morning she walked down to the mill, and the first of the valley's people found her there. He was an old man, lean and weathered, leading a milk cow on a rope along the high path, and he stopped when he saw her and looked at her wagon and her tools with the frank curiosity of a man who has outlived the need for manners. His name was Eli Doss, and he had lived in the valley 60 years, longer than the town, longer than the mill, and he would become the nearest thing to a friend that Cora had in that country. He asked her what she thought she was doing. She told him she had bought the mill. He laughed, but it was a different laugh than the clerk's. More sorrow than scorn in it. That mill drowned the man who built the town, he told her. Drowned him in his own mill race the winter. It went up 19 years back. Bad luck has stood on those stones ever since. You would do better to burn it for the timber. She asked him who the man was who drowned. Eli's face changed, the way an old man's face changes when you have touched a thing he has carried a long time. Tom Harlow, he said, built this whole crossing with his own money and his own back. Then a flood year came and a partner came with it, and by spring Tom was dead in the race and the partner had the deed, and the partner has had everything in this valley from that day to this. He spat into the gravel. Josiah Vane, he said as though the name tasted of rust. Cora set down her water bucket and asked him to tell her the rest. And over the next hour, while the cow grazed and the river talked to itself in its bed, the old man told her the thing the whole valley had agreed to forget. Tom Harlow had come into the country in the late 50s with a young wife and money enough to build a town, and he had built it, the mill first and then the street, and he had hired a Pennsylvania mason to lay the mill's foundation because he wanted it built to outlast him. The mason had come and gone in a single season, and in the winter the mill was finished. Tom Harlow had been found drowned in the mill race below the wheel, and Josiah Vane, who had appeared in the valley only months before with papers showing himself Harlow's partner in the venture, had produced a deed and a note of debt that gave him the mill, the town, and the bottom land the town stood on. Harlow's young widow had contested it and lost, because the papers were in order and the man who could have spoken against them was dead, and she had left the valley with her infant son and had not been heard of since. Vane had run the mill and the valley for 19 years, a hard landlord and a harder creditor, and he lived now in a stone house in Coulter, and owned the bank there and the freight line and the better part of the new rail town. And he was, Eli said, the richest man between Missoula and the Divide, and the most respected, and there was not a soul in the county who would say a word against him, because the men who might have are all gone, or all owe him money. Cora listened to all of it without a word, and when the old man had finished, she asked him only one question. She asked whether Tom Harlow had been a swimmer. Eli looked at her strangely and said, he supposed not many men in that country were. She nodded and picked up her bucket, and she did not tell him that her mentor had built the foundation of that mill, nor that a man who drowns in a mill race, he himself ordered built, is a man who knew the water and respected it, nor that the question of how such a man came to drown had just become the work of her summer. You who are listening have perhaps known a place like that valley where a wrong is so old and so settled that the people have stopped seeing it, where the man who did the thing is the man everyone tips a hat to, and where to say the truth aloud would only mark you as a fool. If you have, then you know what Cora was walking into. She walked into it with a chisel. She began with the water, because nothing could be done while the mill stood drowned. The flood had left a rack of gravel and uprooted timber, damming the old tail race, and the lower story of the mill held the river inside it like a stone cup. The cottonwood that lay across the tail race was the worst of it, a tree near 60 feet long with a root ball taller than she was, and it had wedged itself into the cut of the race so that the water backed up behind it and had nowhere to go. She studied it for the better part of a morning before she touched it, walking around it, putting her hand on it, learning the way its weight lay and the one direction it might be persuaded to move. Amos had told her 1,000 times that the strongest thing a person could bring to a heavy task was not a strong back, but an hour of looking, and she had buried him still believing it. She did not try to lift the tree, she levered it. She drove a length of iron bar under the root ball where the gravel would give her a purchase, and she built a fulcrum of stacked fieldstone beside it the height of her knee, and she hung her whole slight weight on the long end of the bar, and felt the great trunk shift a finger's width in the gravel, and then she moved her fulcrum and did it again. For 9 days she worked at the dam in this fashion, alone, finger's width by finger's width, until the tree lay along the channel instead of across it, and the gravel could be dug from behind it. She dug the gravel by the bucketful, hauling it up the bank in a barrow with a wheel that shrieked for grease she did not have, and on the 10th day the trapped water found its old path, and ran out of the mill in a brown rush that took her a step back and left the lower floor a swamp of silt to her knees. Eli Doss came down on the 3rd day of this, and watched her for an hour from the high path, saying nothing. His milk cow grazing the bank behind him, he went away. He came back on the 4th, with 2 long-handled shovels over his shoulder and a coil of new rope, and the quiet remark that a man with nothing better to do might as well ruin his back as not, and that he had grease for that barrow wheel at his place. He did not ask to be paid. She did not offer. There are kinds of help that an offer of money would spoil, and they both knew it, and so the matter was never raised. Between them, they worked. The silt came out of the mill, 1 barrow load at a time, and as it came, the building gave up the small evidences of the day it died. A grinding stone cracked across its face, too heavy to have been moved by anything but the building's own fall. A ledger desk, swollen and ruined, its drawers fused shut with mud. A child's shoe of cracked brown leather, no bigger than Cora's 2 hands, which Eli held a long while before he set it on a windowsill without a word, and which neither of them spoke of, though Cora marked where he had set it and saw that he straightened it each morning when he came. And along the inner face of the upstream wall as the mud fell away under Cora's shovel and her bare hands where the shovel was too rough, the stonework that Amos Reed had laid 19 years before stood revealed, course by course, and she put her hand against it and felt, under the slime and the river cold. The courses were laid not in the common way, every joint broken cleanly over the stone below, but in a deliberate pattern of long stones and short. Here a header running deep into the wall. There a stretcher laid flat, in a sequence that any other mason walking past would have called wasteful and clumsy, and that she knew. The way she knew the worn place on her chisel handle to be a lock, a mason's lock. A wall built to be opened only by someone who knew the order the stones came out, and to fall on anyone who did not. She did not open it then. There was a season of work between her and that wall, and she did the work in the order the work demanded, which is the only order that holds. She rebuilt the dam properly with stone and brush so the river would not return to undo her. She shored the sagging floor above with new posts cut and squared from the very cottonwood that had nearly crushed the building, dragging each timber in with the mule and setting it plumb by eye. She cleared the wheel pit of 19 years of gravel, and it was there, half buried at the bottom of the race, that she found the thing that turned her suspicion to certainty. The iron shaft of the great wheel lay where it had fallen, snapped clean across, and she rolled it over in the wet gravel to see the break, expecting the ragged fibrous tearing of iron broken by a force greater than itself. That was not what she found. Most of the broken face was the bright crystalline gray of a fresh fracture. True enough. Around its edge, though, a third of the way through the shaft, ran a band of older, darker metal, scored and notched in a regular pattern. The marks of a cold chisel worked patiently into the iron, and then left so that the shaft stood weakened at exactly the point where the flood's force would find it. Someone had cut most of the way through that shaft long ago and left the river to finish the cut. She knelt in the wet gravel, with the broken end in her two hands, and turned it to the light and turned it again, and she understood that she was no longer looking at the wreckage of an accident. She was looking at the tool marks of a murder, word of her travels. Reached the valley and then the rail town, as word does, and the men who had laughed at the sale began to ride out on Sundays to laugh again. They sat their horses on the high path and called down to her that the mill would never grind a sack of meal again, that she had thrown her money in the river, that a woman alone in a drowned ruin was a sight to charge admission for. She let them talk. Once a young man rode down to the floor itself and asked her, half in mockery and half in something else, what she expected to find in a heap of mud. She straightened from her shovel and looked at him and said only that she expected to find what was put there. He did not know what to make of that, and he rode back up to his friends, and they went away, and she went back to her wall. There is a kind of patience that looks from the outside like stubbornness or foolishness and is in truth a form of respect. Cora had it. She had learned it from Amos, who used to say that a stone would tell you everything if you gave it the time it asked for, and nothing less. Through the long, bright weeks of that summer, she gave the mill the time it asked for. She slept in the wagon on the high ground and rose before the light, and worked until the light failed, and Eli came most days, and a thin brown dog of no particular ownership attached itself to her camp and slept against the wheel of the wagon and followed her down to the mill each morning, and she fed it from her own plate and called it nothing. Because to name a thing is to claim it, and she had learned not to claim what she could not keep. By the middle of summer, the lower floor was clear and dry, and the upstream wall stood bare from the silt line to the foundation, and she could read it whole at last. It was as Amos had built it, and as he had described it in the last words. He had breadth for a wall within the wall, and at its base, where the mason's lock began, a course of stones laid in a sequence she recognized the way she would have recognized his handwriting. She stood before it a long time. Then she fetched her tools, the chisels in their oiled roll, and the 12-pound sledge with the hickory handle worn, pale by his hand, and then by hers, and she began. A mason's lock is opened by removing the stones in the reverse of the order they were set, each one bearing a part of the load of the others, so that to pry the wrong stone is to bring the whole face down on the one who tries it. Amos had taught her the principle as a kind of riddle when she was 12, and she had not understood until this summer that he had been teaching her the literal key to a literal door. She read the courses backward from the way they were laid. She found the keystone of the lock, a long gray block, no different to any other eye, and she did not strike it. She struck instead the stone beside it and above it, easing the load, and worked the keystone loose by the patient quarter-inch, and when at last it slid free into her arms it weighed near 100 pounds, and she set it down on the floor as gently as a sleeping child. Behind it was darkness, and cold air, and the smell of a room that had not been breezed in for 19 years. She did not go in that night. She sat on the floor of the mill, with her back against the opened wall, and her hand on the cold gray keystone, and watched the square of darkness until the light failed, and the brown dog came and lay against her, and she let it. She had opened a great many things in her life that men had built to stay shut. She had never opened one that felt, as this one did, like the breath of a person who had been waiting a long time to be let speak. In the gray of the next morning, she lit a lantern and went in. And the chamber was small, a dry stone room no bigger than a wagon bed, walled and floored and roofed in Amos Reed's careful courses, and the flood had never touched it, and the air in it was the air of 1860. Against the far wall stood an iron strong-box, and on a shelf of stone above it lay a flat tin case furred with the dust of 19 years. And beside the strong-box, leaning in the corner, where a man might have set it down meaning to take it up again, was a long-handled cold chisel of the kind a mason uses to score iron, and Cora knew, without touching it, whose hand had last held it and what it had been used for. She stood in the doorway with the lantern, and let the chamber tell her in the order it chose the thing it had kept. The tin case held papers. She carried it out into the light to read them, because the chamber's air was too close and the matter too grave to read in the dark. The papers were 3. The first was a letter in a strong, plain hand, signed by Thomas Harlow, and dated the 11th of November, 1860, addressed to no one and to anyone. The letter of a man who feared he was about to die, and meant to leave a record behind a wall where it would outlast the men who wished him gone. He wrote that his partner, Josiah Vane, had come to him that autumn with a forged note of debt and a demand for half the valley. That he, Harlow, had refused it, and that Vane had told him plainly that the mill which Harlow had built to outlast him. He wrote that he had hired the mason Reed to build this chamber and seal it, and to tell no one, and that if this letter was ever found, it would mean that Vane had made good his threat. He commended his wife Margaret and his son to the mercy of whoever read it, and he asked, in the last line, only that the truth be told to his boy, that his father had not been a fool, nor a drunkard who fell in his own race, but a man who was murdered for what he would not sell. The second paper was the true deed to the mill and the bottomland, in Harlow's name, unencumbered, with no partner named upon it. The third was a sworn and witness statement taken down by Harlow from a hired man named Calloway, who had since vanished from the valley, describing how Vane had paid him to score the iron shaft of the wheel with a cold chisel so that it would fail under the spring flood and carry away the head gate, and how the failure was meant to look like the act of God that took the town's founder. The strong box, when she opened it with the key that hung inside the tin case on a thong, held no gold. It held the original forged note that Vane had used to take the valley, the instrument of the theft itself, which Harlow had somehow got hold of before he died, and had hidden here beside the proof of what it was, so that the lie and the truth that unmade it lay together in the dark for 19 years. Cora sat on the mill floor in the morning light with the papers in her lap and the brown dog at her side and did not move for a long while. She had come west, on a dead man's word, and $11 to crack open a wall, and she had thought if she had let herself think anything, that she might find a wage owed to Amos, or a cache of something that would pay for her trouble. She had found, instead, a murdered man's voice, and a widow somewhere with a grown son who had been told his father was a fool, and the whole weight of a stolen valley resting on a forged paper she now held in her 2 hands. She understood that the finding was not the end of the work. The finding was the beginning of a different and harder work, and she understood, too, that she could not do it the way a man like Vane would expect a wronged person to do it, with an accusation he could buy his way past, but only the way Amos had taught her to do everything in the right order, with the right tool, so that the load was borne by the structure and not by her own thin arms. She did not ride to Coulter and denounce Josiah Vane. She knew what would happen if she did. He owned the bank and the freight line, and the goodwill of every man who feared him, and the word of a strange woman who lived alone in a drowned mill would weigh nothing against his. And the papers might disappear, and so might she. Amos had taught her that you do not pry the keystone first, you ease the load. You find the stone beside it and above it, and you take the weight off by the patient quarter-inch, and only then does the keystone come free into your arms without bringing down the wall. So she began with Eli Doss. She showed him the papers on the floor of the mill, and the old man read Harlow's letter twice, and then sat down on an overturned barrow with his hat in his hands, and wept the dry tears of an old man who has carried a thing too long, because he had been Tom Harlow's friend and had believed with everyone that the man had drowned a fool. He told her that Margaret Harlow had gone to her sister's people in the Willamette country in Oregon 19 years before, and that the boy, who would be a grown man now of 20 years or near it, had been called by his middle name, which was Calder, after his mother's family. Eli knew the name of the sister's town. He had carried it in his memory, the way he carried the child's shoe, against a day he never thought would come. It took the rest of that summer and a good part of the autumn to ease the load. Cora wrote letters, slowly, in the evenings, by the fire, in the careful hand Amos had made her practice on a slate when she was a girl, on the grounds that a mason who could not write a clean letter would be cheated by every man who could. Ellie carried them the 8 miles to Coulter to be posted, because a letter mailed by him drew no notice, and a letter mailed by the strange woman at the drowned mill would have been remarked on and perhaps remembered, and Cora had learned to think about such things. A slow correspondence crossed the mountains to Oregon and back, each exchange a month or more in the going and the coming, the autumn deepening around the valley while the letters traveled. The boy was found. He was 20 years old, named Calder Harlow, working as a wheelwright's apprentice in a river town on the Willamette, a trade he had come to without ever knowing that his own father had built a mill, and his mother Margaret was alive, gray now and worn from 19 years of work in another woman's kitchen. And when she received the letter that told her a sealed chamber had been opened and her husband's own hand had named the man who killed him, she did a thing that Cora had not expected and never forgot. She did not write back at once. She came. She crossed the mountains in the last open weeks before the snow closed the passes, an old woman of 50 with her grown son driving the wagon beside her, and she came straight to the mill that had drowned her husband and stood at last in the chamber that had held his truth for 19 years. Cora led her in by lantern light. The old woman put her hand on the cold gray stone the way Cora had on the first morning, and she read the letter in her husband's hand, standing up, by the light Cora held for her, her son at her shoulder reading it with her, and the only sound in the chamber was the river outside and the old woman's breathing. When she had finished, she folded the letter along the creases. Her husband had folded it on 19 years before, and she held it against her breast, and she said in a voice quiet but firm and not far from breaking, that her boy would know now what his father had been. Then she looked at the bright-edged chisel still leaning in the corner, where the killer's hired man had set it down, and she did not flinch from it, and she said that she had always known the river did not take Tom, that the river had loved him, that he had built half his life along its banks and it would not have turned on him. Cora said that the river had not. The river had only been used the way a tool is used, by a man who knew the difference between an accident and a thing made to look like one. The old woman nodded as though this were something she had waited 19 years to be told. The undoing of Josiah Vane did not happen in a single dramatic scene, because that is not how such things truly happen, and not how this happened. There was a circuit judge who came through Coulter twice a year to hold the county's court, an old and honest man named Pruitt, white-haired and slow-spoken, and the one man of authority in that country who did not owe Vane money and never had, having refused on principle to bank where he gave judgment. To him, in the privacy of his chambers above the Coulter land office, with Margaret Harlow and her son Calder present, and Eli Doss there to swear to the long history of the valley, Cora laid out the papers in their order. She set down the true deed to the mill and the bottomland, in Harlow's name, with no partner upon it. She set down, beside it, the forged note Vane had used to take the valley, so the judge could see the two together. She set down the murdered man's letter in his own strong hand. She set down the sworn statement of the hired man Calloway, describing how he had been paid to score the shaft. And last, she set down the things the chamber had kept that no paper could argue with. The scored cold chisel from the corner, and the broken shaft from the wheel pit with its band of old dark notches that any blacksmith in the territory could read at a glance. She did not accuse, she did not raise her voice, or name Vane a murderer, or ask the judge for anything at all. She set the stones down one by one in the order that made the load impossible to bear, and then she stepped back and let the structure stand on its own, because a thing built true does not need its builder to hold it up. Josiah Vane was never brought to a public reckoning of the kind the valley might have wished to see. He was an old man himself by then, and within a month of the judge's quiet summons to his stone house in Coulter, before any paper could be served, he was gone from the country, having signed over what the law was about to take from him in any case, and ridden out one gray morning toward the Dakota line, and he was not seen in that valley again. Which had been spoken with respect for 19 years, was spoken after that only with the long disgust the valley had not known it was holding back. He had built his whole life on a forged paper and the erasure of a better man, and when the paper was laid beside the truth that unmade it, the life simply came apart, the way a wall comes apart when the keystone is drawn, all at once and without a sound. Cora took no satisfaction in his going that she would have called satisfaction. She had not done the work to ruin a man. She had done it to set a thing right. The deed to the mill and the bottom land passed by the judge's order to Margaret Harlow and her son, the rightful heirs, 19 years late. And here the men who had laughed came back into the story, not to be punished, for Cora wanted none of that, but to be quietly proven wrong in the way that lasts longer than any punishment. The young man who had ridden down to mock her in the spring rode down again in the autumn, hat in hand this time, and asked if there was work, and she put a shovel in his hands. The county clerk who had sold her a grave with a roof had to enter the new deed in his own book, in his own hand, and he did it without meeting her eye. And the valley, which had agreed for 19 years not to see a murder, standing in plain sight, had to see it, and had to see also that the seeing had been done not by any of them, but by a woman they had charged themselves admission to laugh at. Margaret Harlow asked Cora to stay and rebuild the mill, and offered her a wage and a share, and Cora considered it through a long evening by the fire. A mason does not stay where the wall is mended, though. Amos had taught her that too, though never in words. She stayed the winter because the snow gave her no choice, and because the boy Calder wanted to learn the trade and she found she could teach it, putting a chisel in his hand as a man had once put one in hers, and telling him that a stone has a grain the same as wood. By the spring the mill ground its first sack of meal in 19 years, and the wheel that turned it was a new wheel on a sound shaft. And the town of Harris Crossing, which had been a graveyard, had 3 families in it again, and the promise of more. She left in the second spring with the gray mule Pell and the wooden box of tools and the brown dog that had named itself by then, by simply refusing to leave, riding south along the river the way she had come. Margaret walked with her as far as the high path and stopped there, and the 2 women stood a moment looking back at the mill, standing sound in its repaired bed, the new wheel turning, the water running clean through the race where a man had died and a truth had waited. Margaret tried to thank her, and Cora would not quite let her because the thanks belonged, she said, to the man who built the wall, and to the man who built it true, and she meant Amos, and Margaret understood her to mean Amos, and they left it there. What she carried away was not money. The heirs had offered her a fair share, and she had taken only the $11 she had paid for the mill, returned to her, and the cost of her toolsware, because to take more would have made the work into something it was not. What she carried away was the thing Amos had left her, made larger. She had been given a craft and a key and a single dying instruction, and she had used them in the right order with the right tool, and a murdered man had been given back his name, and his son had been given back his father, and a stolen valley had been given back to the people it was stolen from. And none of it had needed a gun or a shout or a single word raised in anger. It had needed only a wall, read backward by someone who had been taught to read it, and the patience to ease the load before drawing the stone. The mill at Hare's Crossing is gone now, as all such things go, taken by a later flood. Or by time, which is the slower flood. For many years after, though, the people of that valley would point out to strangers the foundation of the old gristmill, the lower courses of fieldstone, laid in their strange pattern of long stones and short, and they would tell, if the stranger had time to listen, the story of the woman who paid $11 for a drowned ruin that the whole county had laughed at, and who cracked open the stone chamber inside it alone, and who brought up out of the dark a truth that had been sealed there for 19 years, and set it down in the light, and rode away. And the last of them to tell it, an old man who had been a boy in the valley in those years, used to end the story the same way every time. He would say that he had seen her leave that spring morning, small on her gray mule, with her box of tools behind her and a brown dog trotting at the heel, going south along the river. And he would say that he had not understood, as a boy, why a woman would do so much hard work for a thing she carried away no richer than she came. He understood it now, he would say. He had only had to grow old enough and to watch enough to learn the difference between what a thing is worth and what it costs, and to see that the woman on the mule had known that difference all along, the way she had known how to read a wall, the way some people are simply taught the true measure of things early by someone who loved them, and never afterward forget it. Did you ever know a truth that the world agreed to bury and wonder who it would take to dig it up? Tell me about it. And if this story stayed with you, there is another like it, of a thing dismissed, and a hand patient enough to open it, waiting for you to begin.